likely will exist. And I think this is a good proxy in terms of understanding how the Global South are likely to perceive any initiatives in relation to carbon border adjustment measures. So you have in writ large, still a big level of global inequity, whether it's in terms of the economy, whether it's in terms of again, a proxy in terms of climate vulnerability, whether it's in terms of climate impacts, whether it's in terms of ability to do something on climate change, for example. And I think that is one of those issues which will always be raised when it comes to a discussion about common, carbon border adjustment measures, equity being a foundational principle, not only in climate change action, but also in terms, for example, of trade. And so I've got some nice quotes here that I thought would be useful to flag. But the context of the discussion that we're having is the fact that within the WTO context, there is already quite a lot of work that is taking place in terms of that relationship between trade, environment, and climate change. So, for example, you have existing WTO rules in GATT Article 20B and G, or in GATT's Article 14, or in the TBT agreement or the SPS agreement, or even in TRIPS on the patenting of life forms, or the agreement on agriculture and green box for environmental programs. And those existing WTO rules, I think, form part of the multilateral regime, the policy regime in which we need to, situate this discussion on carbon border adjustment, because they, I think, form a big part of the context in which developing countries would look at that issue. Of course, you also have those WTO disputes, which have created a jurisprudential framework in terms of how these kinds of issues will be approached in the context of a legal dispute before the WTO. And then, in addition to these two main chunks of existing work at the WTO, you have in the Committee on Trade and Environment, the CTE, in the WTO, you have existing work on trade-related environmental measures, on the TRIPS and CBD linkages, on eco-labeling, and then the negotiations under the Doha round in terms of the WTO MEA relationship and the environmental goods and services liberalization. So it's a rather long-winded way of saying that there is already work taking place in the WTO on these particular issues. But I think what we are seeing over the past, say, 3 years is that as the multilateral regime started focusing on climate change, and it went higher and higher up the multilateral policy agenda, we are seeing echoes of that in the WTO, for example. So there is now, even though there is no negotiating mandate, for example, you have trade and climate change now for being undertaken by the Secretariat, with different kinds of work or studies being undertaken by the Secretariat in that area. You also have trade and green economy issues and issues relating to sustainable development goals. A bigger part of the context that I wanted to raise also is that there is a discussion going on already among different sets of members in terms of a plurilateral approach to this. For example, you have environmental goods agreement negotiations that was launched and then suspended. You've got a discussion on trade and environmental sustainability taking place now, with a potential outcome on a joint ministerial statement at MC12. And then you've got this dialogue on plastics and trade. In addition to those plurilateral initiatives, you have several other initiatives that are taking place. So you've got the Japanese proposal on carbon neutrality, for example, that was recently put forward, where they called for a redux of the environmental goods and services liberalization negotiations, further rulemaking in terms of regulatory issues on environmental services and goods, and capacity building. You've got this initiative going on, which is being led by New Zealand on the agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. And then, of course, you've got the EU's CBAM regulation proposal, and we're now hearing noises from the United States, from Canada, in terms of plans to put in place a similar CBAM approach, for example. And then, of course, you've got the new Director General essentially saying that this is on her agenda. So I think what we are seeing is that at the same time that we are seeing all of these initiatives taking place in the WTO context, and also having some echoes in the UNFCCC context, I think there are four main, I think, boxes in which one could view how developing countries or the global south are likely to react to these initiatives. The first box, of course, would be in the upper left, where you have perceptions about these border carbon adjustment measures. One is, of course, is unilateral, which means that for many developing countries, especially those that are deeply engaged as well in the UNFCCC, it could be seen, it most likely will be seen as being a very unilateral, hypocritical, and incoherent approach by developed countries, in the sense that at the same time that developing countries see developed countries being largely still very much in terms of big per capita emitters of greenhouse gases, for example, it's being seen as a way of shifting the burden to developing countries, which often, by and large, still have low per capita emissions. It's also most likely going to be seen as an extraterritorial application of domestic policy, which then brings with it connotations of colonization, of imperialism, and those kinds of highly sensitive political perceptions that could then create complications in terms of how countries would then work with each other on both climate policy and trade policy. And then it could also be seen as a cynical way of generating increased revenue on the backs of developing countries already. So that's one cluster. The second cluster is it could create a risk to the multilateral system by creating a carbon-based trade sanctions regime, which could then fragment the entire regime. Uh, there is a risk that we would see a carbon-based trade war. Um, there is also a risk that, especially for those countries which are continue to be, because of the shape of their economies, continue to be fossil fuel dependent, whether that's in terms of fossil fuel exports or fossil fuel imports for energy, that you will have adverse economic and social consequences, which will be difficult for countries that are already reeling from either a debt crisis or climate impacts, or increased economic vulnerability as a result of the pandemic, which these countries might find more difficult to address. And then there's also the risk of further increasing net wealth transfers from developing to developed countries, and I think a risk that we are looking at a regime where it's more of a one size fits all approach to both climate and trade policy, that is focused on emission reductions purely, and which might not then therefore um, be reflective or respectful of other climate priorities that developing countries might have, for example, on adaptation or loss and damage. Then there's a third cluster in terms of inconsistency with international principles and law. So looking at um, the most likely will be assertions about inconsistency with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in the climate regime, and with special and differential treatment in the trade regime, and inconsistency with this whole spirit of international cooperation that is sort of like deeply embedded in the climate regime. And then fourth cluster, I think, would be whether or not it's actually effective. And I think we are starting to see some studies coming out, including from UNCTAD, for example, and some other academics that are talking about you might not necessarily be able to actually address this carbon leakage um, um, that the EU is front loading as the policy rationale for their policy proposal. It will not also address historical responsibility for climate change. In fact, it completely avoids that discussion, and 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 essentially, I think, creates an increased burden on developing countries, which they might not be able to shoulder. So overall, I think, both over the past, say, decade and a half in which this issue has arisen, and I think more and more what we'll see over the next few years is that, um, developing countries, especially those that, are likely to be affected in terms of their exports by the CBAM proposal, will say that this will have distorted effects. It is not acceptable, and I think that really just goes deeply against the grain of international cooperation that we are trying to foster. So the policy rationale is really about addressing carbon leakage, but again, you have certain um, difficulties there when you talk about carbon leakage, because there are issues that also need to be packaged along with addressing that idea, in terms of also reflecting historical responsibility for carbon emissions over the since the industrial revolution, also of addressing different national circumstances that developing countries might be having. So, what might be the game, or the broader game, that we might be seeing when we talk about these trade and climate initiatives in the WTO, and other areas of work that we are looking at? I think when we look at the broad framing in which many of these initiatives are being put forward, despite their environmental sounding, I think, approach, what we most likely will see there is that these initiatives are about securing expanding market access in environmental goods and services in developing countries. It most likely would involve restricting policy space and flexibility as well, which will have possible implications on further constraining the development of environmental goods and services domestically in developing countries. And it could, in fact, also solidify the current dominance in terms of our environmental goods, for example, and services exports of developed countries vis-a-vis developing countries. Um, we have to contextualize this with, both in the climate regime and the trade regime, a continued insistence by developed countries that when you talk about technology transfer is supposed to take place under voluntary conditions, under mutually agreed terms, uh, preferably through trade. You see in the climate convention developed countries not implementing their technology transfer commitments, and a continued insistence on strong enforcement of intellectual property, especially over environmental goods. Now, why is this important? I think this is important because as we see climate change accelerating, as we see impacts of climate change accelerating, and as we see developed countries, especially in the climate context, pushing for stronger mitigation commitments and targets by developing countries, we are going to be seeing an increase in the market for these kinds of technologies, for environmental goods technologies, particularly. And if that happens, the current dominance, when extended because of these initiatives, will likely see a continued domination of that particular market. And so I think, um, instead of creating a condition in which one sees environmental goods being rapidly disseminated through cooperative technology transfer, and then having developing countries also create their own technologies, we might actually be seeing a more market-driven, corporate-driven approach towards the dissemination of environmental goods, which will make it more difficult for developing countries to participate in. And when you couple it with other systemic failures, whether it's in terms of finance, whether it's in terms of technology transfer or debt, which already affect developing countries, then it is highly likely, whether it's because of the CBAM or because of the other initiatives that are being put forward, which if they come to fruition might actually have an impact, they could actually make it much more difficult for developing countries to do more in terms of combating environmental degradation and undertaking climate action. So if CBAMs were not the way to go, or if, for example, a more corporate or market-oriented approach um, to climate action is not the way to go, then what could be a possible package that we could raise? So one of the things that we in TWN have been focusing on has been to look at sort of like a broad picture approach to action. And so one of the things that we would be saying is then we need to emphasize in developed countries, including within the EU, a more emphasis on domestic mitigation, emission reductions. Could maybe call for a waiver of TRIPS enforcement of environmental goods, for example, moratorium on dispute settlement, increasing technical assistance and support programs, especially on mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and the addressing the consequences of response measures. We could really look at cooperative ways of technology transfer rather than a market approach uh, uh, to using a market-based approach to technology transfer. Financing is going to be a key thing there. And one of those ways in which we have been talking about financing, for example, for climate, is not just to talk about it in the context of climate finance under the UNFCCC, but also talk about it more broadly, so that will include perhaps looking at debt moratoriums and debt cancellation, reforms of the international tax system, increased grant and concessional financing from NDBs, and other things. And finally, I think we need to look at how do you look at financing and support, and so it would not just be project oriented, but really looking at supporting developing countries to diversify their economies away from, say, fossil fuel dependent sectors to ones that are not. And that means really looking at systemic changes that could be supported in developing countries by developed countries through many of these things that I have talked about. So there are some suggestions that we've written up in TWN through this new book that we published earlier this year. And if there are other things that, and we've also done some other work, including with the late Martin Core on this issue over the past decade or so, which you might wish to look at. So let me end there. Thanks, Jean.
Thanks so much, Vice. That was so much in there. That's wonderful. Thank you. So yeah, without further ado, I hand over to Stuti to talk us through a bit more, particularly around the EU's proposals. Stuti.
Thank you, Jean. Good morning or evening or afternoon to everyone who's present today. I'll just take a minute to share the screen, and perhaps Jean, if you could just confirm if you see it.
Yes.
And for bandwidth reasons, I'll stop sharing my video and perhaps we can just start the discussion then. Okay. Taking the discussion forth, I'll be aiming to provide a basic overview of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, its potential WTO consistency issues, and some developing country / LDC implications. Before we step into the intricacies of the discussion, as a general caveat, maybe I'm restating what Mr. Weiss also said, there is no question about the fact that climate change is a global problem. In some form or the other, the implications are being felt across the world, and the intention is set to address it. The question is about how to address climate change in such a way that does not disregard international commitments and does not artificially put some countries at a relative disadvantage. The models designed by countries for addressing climate change need to be cognizant of these disclaimers. CBAM is one such model, and I will attempt to identify some of its limitations from the international trade law perspective. Now, what is CBAM? On 14th July 2021, the European Union released a proposal for a regulation on Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a part of the Fit for 55 European Green Deal package. It will impose a levy on imports in carbon-intensive sectors, including iron and steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity from countries with lower environmental standards than the EU. The mechanism would be implemented starting 2023 with a transition phase up to 2025, during which importers will be subject to significant reporting requirements. Here, the obligation to report includes both direct and indirect emissions. 2026 onwards, importers will have to purchase CBAM certificates to cover their direct carbon emissions at prices corresponding to EU's current carbon price. There is no clarity yet with respect to indirect emissions being included at a later stage. Essentially, the Fit for 55 package has a central theme. That is, carbon emissions should have a price. The CBAM complements it by aligning the carbon price on imports with that applicable within the EU. In terms of scope, it covers imports from all non-EU countries unless either a country participates in the EU ETS, which includes at this stage Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, or if a country has linked their carbon markets to the ETS. At this stage, it includes Switzerland. The overall implication appears to be to get other countries to start levying tax on carbon. Otherwise, either EU's charge would apply, or if there is a similar tax or charge, the difference would be payable to the EU. Now, before getting into its implications under international law, a brief overview of the procedure is as follows. A declarant has to obtain pre-import authorization with submission of specified details. There's a risk assessment that's envisaged, and the account numbers, the CBAM account numbers are allocated, post which entry is made in the national registry. Quarterly reports have to be submitted. Additionally, foreign exporters or producers can voluntarily register in the EU central database for reporting emissions, which is subject to verification. Otherwise, emissions are either calculated by the base method, that is average emission intensity of a country plus a markup, or if no data for average country figures is available, then the fallback method is used, which is based on average emission intensity of 10% worst performing EU installations. With this procedural setup in mind, let's move on to examining some potential WTO compatibility issues vis-a-vis CBAM. On a general note, under the WTO law, all member states are obligated to ensure compliance with the provisions of the covered agreements. One of the potentially hit covered agreement could be the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT 1994. Article 1 and 3 of GATT embody non-discrimination obligations between like products from different countries and vis-a-vis like domestic products versus imported products. A clear implication of the CBAM infrastructure is that like products from different installations and eventually different countries could be taxed differently based on base values, default values, or actual emissions. Here, as the embedded carbon would be resulting from a non-product related production and process method referred to as NPR PPM, its extent of impact on the likeness from installations of different countries is a question that hasn't been answered sufficiently, but perhaps in the future panels could answer for it. The past practice of appellate body, however, has indicated that different NPR PPMs generally do not render products unlike. Hence, in the process of establishing discrimination under Article 1 and 3, embedded carbon-based product distinction could be potentially expected to not affect likeness unless a decision in the future goes otherwise. Here, the very fact that different values of taxes would apply to products from different countries could establish a potential breach. Further, under Article 2.2a of GATT, the principle enshrined is to ensure that internal tax and the charge imposed, with some additional caveats, in respect of either a like domestic product or an article from which an imported product has been manufactured or produced, has to be equivalent. Before examining it, a factual disclaimer is that the price of CBAM certificates would be determined by the weekly average price of EU ETS allowances sold. Now, these ETS allowances are financial instruments which are traded since 2018. So market factors of demand and supply play a role in their valuation. Now, coming back to the examination, there are three important questions under Article 22A that would need to be answered. Firstly, is the ETS allowance price the relevant internal tax for this computation? Secondly, could carbon fall within the ambit of an article from which the imported product has been manufactured or produced? Thirdly, would using weekly average price of ETS for determining the CBAM certificate price meet the threshold of equivalence? All the three questions are complex determinations. With regard to the first question on internal tax, the standard has been defined in the article itself as imposed consistently with the provisions of Article 3.2. With respect to the second question, keeping at bay the lack of consensus among GATT contracting parties historically, or even works of the Working Party on border tax adjustment and the US Superfund dispute, the current position is that there is no clarity on whether or not embedded carbon could fall within the scope of an article from which the imported product has been manufactured or produced. With regard to the third question on equivalence, assuming that the ETS allowance is the relevant internal tax, and either in terms of likeness or in terms of an article from which an imported product has been manufactured or produced, the requisite thresholds have been met, the test of equivalence of the charge versus internal tax will be a critical issue. Oxford Dictionary defines equivalent to imply equal in value, amount, function. Here, which definition of equivalent is the EU trying to hit at, and whether or not the same justifies the threshold sought under this article would be an interesting assessment in the future. Further, without delving much into detail, with the cumbersome reporting requirements imbibed on the importers, which could be expected to fall on the shoulders of producers or exporters, where it is required to report direct and indirect emissions, at least in the transitional phase, potential claims under Article 11 of GATT can also be raised. Now, coming down to the more important question of whether or not EU would be able to justify CBAM under Article 20 of GATT. At the outset, it's important to note that Article 20 of GATT lists out the general exceptions. These general exceptions can be relied upon to justify breaches from other articles of GATT. Now, there are 10 rationales listed out in paragraphs A to J of Article 20, out of which paragraph G relates to conservation of exhaustible natural resources. The legal standard under Article 20 is very high, and almost all cases where a party chose to rely on Article 20 has failed to justify. So if the EU was to place reliance on it, it would have to firstly demonstrate that its measure meets the requirement of the language of the paragraph claimed. Secondly, that it meets the requirement of the chapeau. On examining the language of the paragraph, could EU argue that air is an exhaustible natural resource which its measure CBAM is trying to conserve is a question worth asking. In terms of the objective listed by EU of addressing carbon leakage, it is important to stress that there is limited evidence suggesting carbon leakage as a reality. Trade scholars have opined that citing leakage, EU talks about risks rather than certainty. And studies, for instance, by UNCTAD have suggested that CBAM would reduce global carbon dioxide emissions by just 0.1%. So beyond what it seeks to achieve, to what extent could EU CBAM demonstrate meeting its objectives sought remains a dicey territory. The second layer of assessment under Article 20 are the thresholds specified in the chapeau, which are rather more difficult parts of the test. There are three questions here. Firstly, is the measure applied in a manner that would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where same conditions prevail? Secondly, is it a disguised restriction on international trade? Thirdly, could the challenging party present an alternative which meets the same objective and does not face the above two issues? With respect to the first requirement of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination, the way CBAM works is such that it requires even those countries which have, for instance, an ETS regime in place to pay according to the EU ETS-based price, if there is a price difference. despite differentiated commitment levels under international environmental law. Now, subjecting countries with differentiated emission reduction commitment levels to the same treatment, could it be classified as arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination? It would be an interesting examination by eventual planners or appellate body. However, it is also important to note that appellate body has opined that given discrimination must be linked with the objective of the measure and must not go against that objective. So for those paying the price difference from ETS price could argue that CBAM defeats the objective. This is so because when the other country has its own ETS in place, it already meets the objective. So the difference in price being paid to EU does not stand justified anymore. Hence, there could be a potential for this requirement of the chapeau not being met. This slide shows the results of a study by Hannah Ritchie, 2019, where historical emissions are demonstrated. To give a picture to our examination, if EU CBAM was to be looked at with 22% historical emissions of EU across 1751 to 2017, vis-a-vis, say, Indonesia's emissions at 0.8%, could EU's ETS price being extended to Indonesia be justified? Potentially unlikely. From this chart, it appears that to efficiently address emissions, per capita emission-based policies could be a good instrument, especially to target the larger chunk of historical emissions by developed countries. Clearly, the design of CBAM disregards many aspects that should have been taken into account. So essentially, by extending its own decarbonization goals on other countries, EU's CBAM measure falls short on the requirements that could have justified it under Article 20 of CAT. Coming to a short overview of the implications for developing countries, as is noted by trade scholars as well, EU's proposed CBAM risks unfairly penalizing exports of developing countries. The concerns about CBAM's impact on developing countries has already been raised in WTO's Market Access Committee with a particular focus on EU's public framing of CBAM as a revenue-raising tool and a contributor towards EU's own resources rather than as a means of addressing climate change. A study by Center for European Reform opines that it is unreasonable to expect poorer countries to shoulder the same burden as those that are richer and have historically contributed to a larger share of cumulative carbon emissions. While the CBAM does not talk about developing countries and their differentiated status at all, what is noteworthy is that a report appended to the proposal on CBAM attempts to justify the rationale for not creating carve-outs for LDCs. It states, blanket exemptions from a CBAM should be avoided, as setting up such a mechanism will encourage LDCs to increase their level of emission and run counter to the overarching objective of CBAM. This understanding seems questionable on many fronts, which have already been identified by Mr. Weiss as well. It blatantly disregards international environmental law principles and throws away years of progress in the bin. What about emissions by LDCs if done within their nationally determined contributions? Wouldn't LDCs have the bandwidth to emit within their NDCs? Why do the initial rungs of the ladder have to be dirty when those on the top can afford to clean them? What about financing sustainable or green industries for LDCs, or for that fact, even for developing countries? These are some of the many questions that the CBAM proposal fails to answer sufficiently. With that, I pass the floor back to Jean. Thank you.
Thank you so much.